Hello, my name is Ethan Hale, and the night I learned I wasn't enough smelled like rain, expensive wine, and humiliation. I walked into a restaurant I couldn't afford, holding roses I bought with overtime tips, proud of the woman I loved. A stranger looked at me and called me a delivery guy. My fiancé didn't correct her. In a parking lot lit by yellow lights, she returned my ring and said she needed someone on her level. 3 months later, an $8 hospice delivery would tear that belief apart. But standing there that night, empty-handed and discarded, I wondered one thing. Was I really beneath her? Or did I just not know who I was yet? By the time most people were pouring their first cup of coffee, my day was already half gone. My alarm went off at 3:58 a.m., set to vibrate so it wouldn't wake Lillian. I never needed the sound anyway. My body learned the schedule the way prisoners learn counts. I slid out of bed quietly, joints stiff, back already aching before I stood upright. The apartment was dark and cold, the kind of cold that clings to your bones even indoors. I pulled on yesterday's jeans and a hoodie that smelled faintly of concrete dust no matter how many times I washed it. In the kitchen, I moved on instinct. Eggs, toast, coffee. Her coffee, always first. I poured it into her favorite mug, the one from her law school bookstore, blue with gold lettering that said something about justice and legacy. I covered the plate with foil and left a note beside it. Crush it today. Love, E. I wrote some version of that note every morning, not because it was poetic, but because it was true. Her days mattered. Mine were just what paid for them. By 4:40, I was in my truck, breath fogging the windshield as I drove toward the construction site. The city looked different at that hour. Empty. Honest, no suits, no traffic, no pretending. Just streetlights buzzing overhead and men like me lining up to trade pieces of our bodies for a paycheck. Frank Doherty was already there when I arrived, hard hat on, coffee in hand, built like a retired linebacker who never quite stopped being angry at the world. He looked me over the way he always did, eyes narrowing slightly. "You sleep at all, Hale?" he asked. "Sleep's optional," I said, grabbing my gloves. He snorted. "So is breathing, eventually." Frank liked me. I think it was because I never complained. Or maybe because he recognized the look. Desperation has a face. You see it enough times, you don't forget it. We spent the morning pouring foundation for a pediatric wing at a new hospital. The irony wasn't lost on me. My hands cracked and bled inside my gloves while we built something meant to heal other people. By noon, my shoulders were screaming and my shirt was soaked through. I didn't stop. I never stopped. Marcus Bell worked beside me, steady and quiet, a man with 2 kids and a wife who packed him real lunches. Around 1 o'clock, he nudged a sandwich toward me. "Take it," he said before I could refuse. "My wife will yell at me if I come home with extras." I took it because I needed the calories more than my pride needed the win. We ate sitting on overturned buckets, dust clinging to everything. "You're killing yourself," Marcus said finally. "It's temporary," I replied. 4 years is a long temporary. "It's an investment." He looked at me then, really looked. "Investments are supposed to pay dividends, man." I didn't answer. I couldn't, because if he was wrong, then everything I was doing made sense. And if he was right, I didn't know who I was anymore. At 6 p.m., while the other guys talked about beers and ball games, I washed my hands in a sink that never quite got clean and drove straight to the warehouse. Different uniform, same body. The night crew moved pallets like machines, and I became one of them. Lift, stack, Scan. Repeat. Around 3 in the morning, my hands shook so badly I had to steady them against my thighs. By the time I got home, Lillian was asleep. Law books fanned around her like she'd fallen mid-battle. I stood there for a moment, watching her breathe, feeling something between love and grief tighten in my chest. This was why. This was always why. Weekends blurred into delivery routes and GPS voices. Rain, snow, traffic. I memorized the city one address at a time. People took bags from my hands without looking at my face. That was fine. I didn't need to be seen. I just needed to keep going. My life wasn't about living. It was about holding things together long enough for her to cross the finish line. And I believed, with everything I had left, that when she did, there would be room for me on the other side. Lillian Crow never believed in vague futures. She believed in timelines. She had one taped inside the front cover of her planner when I first met her. Color-coded and ruthless. Graduate with honors. Law school. Top firm. Corner office before 40. Every step mapped like a war plan. I remember thinking how comforting that was. How rare it felt to meet someone who knew exactly where she was going. We met in a coffee shop near my community college, the kind with chipped mugs and a burned espresso machine. She was sitting alone, surrounded by books, attacking a political science text with a highlighter like it had personally offended her. I offered her mine when hers ran dry. She looked up, smiled, and said, "You just saved my life." That was all it took. In the beginning, she loved the way I listened. Loved that I showed up. Loved that I didn't compete with her ambition. Only made room for it. When she talked about law school, her whole face changed. She became electric. Certain. I would watch her pace our tiny living room, practicing arguments out loud, and think that the world didn't stand a chance. "You're my foundation," she used to say at night, curled against me, books stacked on the floor. I couldn't do this without you. I believed her because I wanted to. Because believing felt easier than asking what she meant by that. Law school changed the air around her. Slowly at first. New words entered her vocabulary. New people. New silences. Our apartment filled with heavier books and lighter conversations. She studied constantly, and I learned how to make myself small around the edges so I wouldn't distract her. That was when I first met Vivienne Locke. She came over with Lillian's study group one evening, wearing a tailored blazer and an expression that suggested she was always evaluating something. She shook my hand and glanced at my calloused fingers like they were a curiosity. "So, Ethan," she said, smiling without warmth, "what do you do?" "I'm in construction," I answered, "and logistics, and delivery." Her eyebrow lifted almost imperceptibly. "Busy." Lillian jumped in before I could say anything else. "He's very entrepreneurial." Vivian nodded, satisfied, as if a box had been checked. The conversation moved on, but something stayed behind. A residue. The sense that I'd been measured and quietly dismissed. After that, it happened more often. Dinners where I felt like background noise. Conversations where Lillian answered questions meant for me. Plans discussed as if I were a variable, not a constant. When she got into law school, I dropped out of mine without hesitation. Business management could wait. Her future couldn't. I told myself this was what partnership looked like. One person runs ahead, the other clears the path. But some nights, lying awake beside her, listening to her type, I wondered when exactly I'd stopped being part of the plan and started being the support structure beneath it. Foundations don't get thanked, they get buried. And I didn't yet realize how deep she was already digging. 4 years can disappear without making a sound. They don't collapse all at once. They erode, slowly, quietly, one alarm at a time. My life settled into a rhythm so rigid it felt mechanical. Construction before sunrise, warehouse through the night, delivery routes stitched into whatever hours were left. 7 days a week. No holidays, no sick days. Pain became background noise, like traffic or wind. If something hurt, it meant I was still moving. The construction site was the only place where effort still had a language I understood. Concrete didn't care who you were or what you wanted. You showed up, you worked, or you failed. Frank Doherty ran the crew like a drill sergeant with a conscience. He barked orders, cursed freely, and noticed everything. "You look like hell," he told me one morning as I pulled on my hard hat. "Been worse," I said. He studied me for a moment, then handed me the overtime sheet without a word. That was his version of kindness. Marcus Bell watched me the way men do when they recognize something familiar and dangerous. He'd catch me staring off between lifts, hands shaking from fatigue, eyes hollow. "You ever sleep in that truck of yours?" he asked once. "Sometimes," I said. "That ain't a flex." I shrugged. I didn't have the energy to defend myself anymore. Pride burns calories. The warehouse nights blurred together. Fluorescent lights, endless pallets. A supervisor who ran the floor like a military drill and didn't ask questions as long as numbers stayed green. Around 3 a.m., my body would start betraying me. Hands trembling, vision narrowing. I'd lean against a steel rack and breathe until the world steadied again. Driving home at dawn, I'd sometimes pull over and rest my forehead against the steering wheel just for 30 seconds. Just long enough to remember my own name. At home, Lillian's world kept expanding. Our dining table vanished under casebooks and color-coded notes. Sticky notes covered the fridge with legal terms I couldn't pronounce. The living room became her mock courtroom. I sat on the couch and played jury while she practiced closing arguments, voice sharp, eyes burning with certainty. She was brilliant. There was no denying it. Watching her made the exhaustion feel justified. This was the return on investment. This was what all of it was for. Her study group came by often. Preston with his polished laugh, Gabriella with her internship stories, Vivienne, always composed, always watching. They talked about firms and futures and cities they planned to live in like it was all inevitable. "What about you, Ethan?" Gabriella asked one night, feigning interest. "What's your plan once Lillian passes the bar?" Before I could answer, Lillian smiled and said, "He's keeping his options open." Entrepreneurial silence. That was my role. I used to have plans. Before my father died, I was studying business management, dreaming about opening a small auto shop that treated people fairly. I even had a name picked out. That dream died quietly, buried under tuition bills and rent and bar prep courses. I told myself dreams were flexible. Love wasn't. By the 4th year, my body started sending warnings I ignored. I threw up behind the site one afternoon and wiped my mouth with the back of my glove before clocking back in. I slept in my truck between shifts because driving home wasted time I couldn't afford. Lillian never saw that part. She saw the meals I cooked, the notes I left, the calm voice telling her she'd be fine. And I kept believing that when the race was over, she'd turn around and see me still standing there. I didn't realize that while I was surviving for us, she was already learning how to live without me. The bar exam results came in on a Tuesday, gray and wet, the kind of day that settles into your bones. I was knee-deep in concrete when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I ignored it at first. Phones didn't belong on sites like this. But it buzzed again, insistently, and Marcus shot me a look, Go on, he said. Could be important. I wiped my hands on my jeans and checked the screen. I passed. There were champagne emojis, confetti, a smiling face that felt brighter than the weather had any right to be. For a second, I forgot where I was. I laughed out loud, a sharp sound that surprised even me. Marcus clapped me on the back hard enough to knock the breath out of me. Frank noticed from across the site. He walked over, scowling like he always did. "She pass?" he asked. I nodded. He stared at me for a long moment, then said something I'd never heard him say before. "Get out of here. Paid. Go do whatever it is people do when their lives work out." I didn't argue. I drove straight to a wine shop downtown. The kind with polished wood floors and salespeople who look you over before deciding how helpful to be. I spent more money than I ever had on a single bottle. French champagne, wrapped like it mattered. It did. To me. Next came the roses, $60. Red, full, unapologetic. The woman at the counter smiled when she handed them to me. "Someone's lucky," she said. "She earned it," I replied. Lillian texted that she was celebrating with her study group at an Italian place downtown. Vincenzo's. I knew it only as a delivery address. I'd dropped food at the back door once or twice. Appetizers cost more than my daily food budget. I'd never been inside. I went home first. Showered until the water ran cold, scrubbing concrete dust from my skin. I put on my one good shirt, the blue button-down I reserved for funerals and interviews that never went anywhere. I tried to clean under my fingernails, but some stains don't come out. Vincenzo's glowed against the rain, all glass and warm light. A valet opened the door for someone in front of me and barely glanced in my direction. Inside, the air smelled like butter and wine and money. I spotted Lillian immediately. She sat at the center of the table, hair pinned up, wearing a black dress I hadn't seen before. She looked different, not happier, sharper. Vivienne Locke sat to her right, elegant and composed. Preston and the others leaned in, laughing, already halfway into a world I didn't recognize. I approached with the roses hidden behind my back, my heart pounding harder than it ever had on a job site. Vivienne saw me first. Her eyes flicked to my shirt, my boots, my hands. Then she smiled, just enough to be cruel. "Oh," she said, her voice carrying. "I didn't realize deliveries were allowed through the front." The table went quiet. No one laughed. No one corrected her. Lillian's shoulders stiffened. She looked at me, then at them, then back at me, again, like she was calculating something she didn't want to say out loud. "I wanted to surprise you," I said, forcing a smile as I brought out the roses. "You did it. I'm so proud of you." She took them quickly and set them on an empty chair, like they didn't belong in her hands. "Thank you," she said, not to me, to the table. I stood there holding the champagne, suddenly aware of how much space I was taking up. Preston checked his watch. Someone cleared their throat. "Can we talk?" Lillian said, already standing. She walked ahead of me, heels clicking against marble. In the parking lot, under soft yellow lights, the rain finally stopped. The silence felt heavier than the weather. She crossed her arms. "Ryan, Ethan, we need to be honest." I nodded. "I thought this was about schedules, adjustments, growing pains." She sighed, the way you sigh at a problem you've already solved. "I need someone on my level now." The words landed clean and final. I looked down at the bottle in my hands, at the ring in my pocket, at the life I'd built around her success, and understood, all at once, that this celebration was never meant to include me. and there was nothing I could say that would change that. The parking lot felt too quiet for what was happening. Yellow lights hummed overhead. Rain clung to the pavement in thin, reflective sheets. Somewhere inside the restaurant, laughter rose and fell, sealed behind glass and money. Out here, it was just the two of us, and the truth she'd finally decided to say out loud. "I didn't mean to hurt you," Lillian said, which was how I knew she had. I waited. My hands were numb, though I couldn't tell if it was the cold or the realization settling into my bones. "You knew this would change things," she continued. "Law firms don't run on good intentions. They run on perception, image, alignment." "Alignment with what?" I asked. She hesitated, then looked at me like I was a problem she'd already worked through. "With the life I'm building," I tried to keep my voice steady. "We're building it." "No," she said gently. "You were supporting me while I built it." The difference hit harder than the words themselves. I reminded her of the plans, the wedding we'd talked about, the apartment we were supposed to outgrow together. I told her I could change my schedule, go back to school, do whatever it took. She laughed softly. Not cruelly. Worse, like I didn't understand the rules of a game she'd already won. "Look at us," she said. "Do you really think this was ever going to work long term?" 4 years collapsed into a single question. "I worked 3 jobs," I said. "For you. For us." "And that was your choice," she replied. "I never asked you to do that." I felt something tear loose inside my chest. "You said I was your foundation." She nodded. "Foundations don't get credit. They get built over." She reached for my hand then, not to hold it, but to press the engagement ring into my palm. The diamond was small, real, paid for in overtime, sold tools, and one watch that had belonged to my father. "Keep it," she said. "Maybe you can finally do something nice for yourself." Then she turned and walked away. I watched her heels click back toward the entrance, watched the doors open for her without question. Inside, Vivienne leaned in to say something that made the table laugh. Lillian smiled like someone who'd just shed a burden. Her new car sat a few spaces away from my truck, sleek, polished, purchased with a signing bonus that dwarfed my annual income. I stood there a moment longer, holding a bottle I couldn't afford and a ring no one wanted, before getting in and driving home. The ride was silent. No radio. Just the sound of wipers pushing away rain that kept coming anyway. When I opened the apartment door, I knew immediately she'd been there. Half the closet was empty. The law books were gone. The desk cleared. She'd left the couch, the dishes, the cheap furniture we'd bought together because it was easier to abandon what had no value. On the counter was a note. "The lease is paid through the end of the UDU month. Good luck." That was it. 4 years reduced to 2 words. I sat on the couch and opened the champagne. The cork popped too loudly in the quiet room. I drank straight from the bottle, not to celebrate, but to mark the end of something I'd mistaken for love. That night, I learned the cost of believing that giving everything meant you'd be allowed to stay. And I went to sleep alone, surrounded by the echo of a life I'd built for someone else. 3 months after Lillian left, I learned how quiet a life can get. I moved into a studio above a Chinese restaurant on Belmont Street, a place where the smell of oil and soy sauce crept through the floorboards and settled into everything I owned. The rent was cheap. The ceiling was stained. The radiator clanged all night like it was arguing with itself. The window faced a brick wall so close I could touch it if I leaned out far enough. It wasn't home, but it was mine. I quit the warehouse job first. The nights were too long, the silence too loud. A few weeks later, I cut back on construction. Frank tried to talk me out of it, his voice rough with something like concern. "You don't let someone break you like this," he said. "You hear me?" "I'm not broken," I replied. "I'm just tired." That wasn't entirely true. I was broken. I just didn't have the energy to deal with it yet. I kept the delivery job because it asked the least of me. No thinking, no planning. Just directions on a screen and bags of food passed from one set of hands to another. People rarely looked at my face. That was a relief. Luis Calderon noticed the change immediately. He ran the evening shift with the kind of authority that came from raising kids and surviving disappointment. Short, solid, always watching. One night, as I loaded my bags, he stopped me. "You used to smile," he said. "Now you look like you're attending your own funeral." "Some days it feels like I am," I answered. He nodded slowly. "You lost someone." "Something," I corrected. He leaned closer. "Careful. If you forget who you were before her, you'll spend the rest of your life trying to replace her instead." I didn't know how to tell him that I couldn't remember who that guy was. Without Lillian to orbit around, my days lost their shape. I woke up late, ate when I remembered, slept in my clothes. The calluses on my hands started to soften, and that scared me more than the loneliness. Work had been my proof that I existed. At night, I lay on the narrow bed, listening to the radiator hammer away, replaying moments I should have noticed sooner. The pauses in her voice, the way she stopped saying "we," the look she'd given me in that restaurant, like I was a chapter she'd already finished reading. I didn't cry. Crying required energy. I just went numb. On a Tuesday night in December, my phone buzzed with a new order. Chicken soup, saltine crackers, $8 total. Delivery address, Willow Crest Hospice Residence, room 247. I hovered over the decline button. It was a long drive across town for almost nothing. Normally, I wouldn't have thought twice, but something made me accept it. Maybe it was the word hospice. Maybe it was the cold. Maybe it was the feeling that if I stayed in my apartment one more night listening to the walls breathe, I might disappear entirely. I picked up the order, the soup warm against my palm, and started the engine? I didn't know it yet, but that drive was the first step I'd taken in months that wasn't about surviving someone else's dream, and it was about to change everything. Willow Crest sat on the edge of the city like it had nothing left to prove. Manicured hedges, soft lighting, a circular drive with a fountain that kept running even in winter. The kind of place built to make the end feel less sharp. I parked farther away than I needed to and sat there for a moment. The engine idling, soup warming the cab with the smell of salt and chicken. Inside, the air was quieter than anywhere I'd been in months. Not silent, just careful. The receptionist looked up with a practiced smile that softened when she saw the delivery bag. "Room 247, she said gently. "End of the hall. Hospice wing." The hallway felt longer than it should have. Doors stood half open, offering brief glimpses into private endings. An old man stared at a muted television. A woman slept while someone held her hand like they were afraid to let go. I walked slower without meaning to. Room 247 was the last door. I knocked lightly. "Come in," a voice said, thin but steady. Dorothy Kincaid lay propped against white pillows, her frame small beneath the blankets, lavender cardigan folded neatly around her shoulders. Her hair was silver and carefully brushed, but her eyes were sharp, impossibly blue, tracking me the moment I stepped inside. "Dinner delivery," I said, forcing cheer into my voice. "Chicken soup and crackers." I set the bag on the nightstand and turned to leave. "Wait," she said. I stopped. She stared at my chest, then my face, then my name tag. Her hand flew to her mouth. What did you say your name was? Ethan, I replied. Ethan Hale. The change in her was immediate. Her breath caught. Tears welled fast, spilling down her cheeks. For a terrifying second, I thought I'd triggered something medical. Are you... she whispered, voice shaking. Are you Catherine's son? The room tilted. No one used my mother's name. I barely remembered hearing it aloud. Yes, I said slowly, but she died when I was born. Dorothy let out a sound somewhere between a sob and a prayer. She reached for me with both hands. Oh, thank God, she said. Sit down, please. I've been looking for you for 35 years. I sank into the chair beside her bed, heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. She told me she'd been a nurse, labor, and delivery, that she'd been there the night I was born, that my mother had known something was wrong, that she'd pressed an envelope into Dorothy's hands and made her swear to keep it safe. From the nightstand drawer, she pulled out a small key on a chain and held it up like it was sacred. She said you'd understand when you were older, Dorothy said. You're 32 now, aren't you? I nodded, numb. I kept the promise, she whispered. I never stopped looking. I stared at the key, at the woman who'd carried a secret longer than I'd been alive, and felt the ground under my life begin to shift. My mother hadn't disappeared. She had been waiting. Dorothy talked the way people do when time has finally stopped pretending. She told me her full name then, as if it mattered now, and how she'd been 25 and working the overnight shift at St. Mary's the night my mother came in. How Catherine had looked calm on the outside, but terrified in the way only women who know their bodies can be terrified. She knew, Dorothy said, gripping a tissue. The doctors kept saying everything was fine, but she knew. 2 days before I was born, my mother pulled her aside, pressed an envelope into her hands, made her swear, not on paperwork, not on policy, on decency. She said if anything happened to her, you were to get it when you were old enough to understand, Dorothy said. She said 30 would be enough. I added a couple years, just to be sure. From the drawer, she took out a manila envelope, yellowed at the edges, softened by decades of handling. I could see faint water stains on the corners, as if it had been cried over more than once. Your mother wasn't just Catherine Hale, Dorothy said quietly. She was Catherine Rowan. The name meant nothing to me. Not yet. She explained slowly, pausing for breath, like she was rationing time. The Rowan family. Old money. Real estate that stretched across states. A name etched into buildings and donor walls. My mother had grown up in a world that never worried about rent or grocery bills. My father had worked as a mechanic on the Rowan estate. He fixed vintage cars. He kept his head down. He fell in love with the wrong woman. They gave her a choice, Dorothy said, the inheritance or the man. My mother chose my father, walked away with nothing but her clothes and her certainty. Her parents never forgave her. Dorothy's eyes shone with something close to reverence. But she was smarter than they thought, she continued. Her grandmother left her a separate trust, quiet, untouchable. It was meant to mature when Catherine turned 35. My hands shook as I opened the envelope. Inside were legal documents, account statements, and a letter written in careful looping script. Catherine Rowan Hale. Read that first, Dorothy said. Everything else will make sense after. I unfolded the letter. My dearest Ethan, if you are reading this, it means I didn't survive to hold you. I am writing this 2 days before your birth. and I have a feeling I won't see the other side of it." Her words didn't feel old. They felt immediate. She told me I wasn't the reason she died, that I was the best thing she ever did, that she chose love over money and never regretted it for a second. She told me my father loved her in a way her parents never understood. She told me about the trust, about investments she'd made quietly, about companies she believed in before anyone else did. She told me the money wasn't the point. Freedom was. By the time I reached the end, I couldn't see the page through. My tears. Dorothy squeezed my hand. "Look at the statement." The numbers didn't make sense at first. 8 million. Growth. Decades of careful stewardship. A current valuation circled in pen. $43 million. The room felt like it tipped sideways. "My husband managed it," Dorothy said softly. "He treated it like it was his own child. The lawyers have been waiting for you." I thought of the restaurant, the parking lot, the word level. The irony burned so clean it almost hurt to breathe. For the first time since my mother died, I understood what she'd really left me. Not money, proof that I had always been enough. I sat in my truck outside Willow Crest for almost 2 hours after I left Dorothy's room. The engine was off. The envelope rested on the passenger seat like it might disappear if I stopped looking at it. $43 million. My mother's handwriting. A life I didn't know existed pressed flat into paper and numbers. I kept expecting the shock to fade into something manageable, but it didn't. It just sat there with me, heavy and real. The next morning, I walked into Commonwealth Trust Bank wearing the same jeans and work jacket I'd worn the night before. The lobby smelled like polish and money and quiet authority. I asked about a safety deposit box that hadn't been opened in 35 years. The teller looked at me the way people do when they think you're confused. That changed when I set the key and the documents on the counter. Suddenly, I wasn't invisible anymore. I was escorted into a private room, offered water, called Sir. Inside the box were pieces of a woman I never got to meet. My parents' wedding photos. My mother smiling at my father like the world had narrowed down to one man, and that was enough. Her engagement ring. Simple. Worn smooth with love. Jewelry passed down from a grandmother who'd known the truth before anyone else did. I didn't sell a single thing. The lawyers came next. Lockwood, Pierce, and Hale. The name alone felt surreal. The same firm Lillian worked for, grinding 80-hour weeks for a salary that now felt like pocket change. Vivian Locke sat in on the meeting. When she recognized me, something flickered across her face. Surprise, calculation, restraint. I didn't acknowledge it. Paperwork took days, transfers, trusts, portfolios. I signed where they told me, listened when it mattered, and ignored the rest. The money felt abstract, like it belonged to someone else. What felt real was Dorothy. I moved her into a private suite with round-the-clock care, fresh flowers every day, specialists, quiet dignity. She protested at first, weakly. "You don't owe me," she said. "You kept a promise for 35 years, I told her. "This is nothing." I kept working deliveries for a while. I wasn't ready to stop being who I was. Every night I sat with Dorothy and listened to stories about my mother, about how she laughed, about how she loved my father without hesitation. Dorothy passed 3 weeks later. I held her hand when she went. "Tell Catherine I kept my promise," she whispered. After the funeral, which I paid for and attended with only one nurse and a quiet thank you, I made my choices. I blocked Lillian's number when the calls started coming. 17 in one day. Texts about misunderstandings, timing, Regret. I didn't read past the first line. I bought the building her firm rented space in, not to evict anyone, not to make a point, just to know. That was enough. Then I did something that felt right. I started Maria's Table, a non-profit that delivers free meals to hospice patients, real meals, warm food, human contact. I paid drivers well, benefits, respect. Marcus Bell was my first hire. Frank Doherty came out of retirement to help run operations. He told me he always knew I'd be more than concrete. I met my grandparents once. They were old. Regret had hollowed them out. I forgave them because my mother would have wanted me to. Forgiveness didn't mean closeness. It meant peace. 6 months later, on a delivery run, I ran into Mara Ellison, a hospice nurse with tired eyes and a steady kindness. She didn't ask about my money. She asked why I still delivered meals myself. Because it matters, I said. That was enough for her. Somewhere along the way, I realized something simple and irreversible. I was never beneath anyone. I was just standing in the wrong room. My mother chose love over money. My father chose dignity over pride. Dorothy chose loyalty over comfort. And when it was my turn, I chose the same. I have money now, more than I'll ever need. But that isn't the inheritance that saved me. What saved me was knowing, finally, that I had always been enough.